let's move on to Puerto Rico. This is one which we really wanted to get to the bottom of, which is what the hell is happening on an island where 5 years ago we watched the power grid completely fail and then take nearly a year to be restored. It was one of the biggest political stories. There was all these allegations of neglect and more. And I think what we're really learning after the strike of another hurricane tragedy on Puerto Rico, where millions of people, once again, are without power, is that this is a systemic story of corruption. So at the very beginning, though, let's just acknowledge the latest damage that is happening right now in Puerto Rico. Let's put this up there on the screen. Our friend Jeff Stein, pulled this TikTok, which just shows you the side-by-side analysis and just like how horrific the water, the flooding, the absolute and damage is that is on the ground, cars there that are floating literally in the middle of the street. So untold like amounts of damage to critical infrastructure, to roads, once again. Now, hurricane, all of that, we can put that aside as it's a long time event in the Atlantic, and especially has gotten worse in the last couple of years. But the question remains, like, this grid failed 5 years ago. It was one of the biggest stories in the country. Congress appropriated up to $100 billion in order to fix and rebuild. And then 5 years later, a hurricane strikes and the whole grid is down and 3 million people are without power again. So what the hell is happening here?
And it's not just, it reminds me, sorry to cut you off, it reminds me of Jackson. With the water, where, we covered back when they had that winter storm, there was a massive water crisis, and we're like, oh my God, this is a disaster. Like, we have to freaking fix this water system. And everybody knew it's a problem. And national media covered it for 5 seconds. And then nothing happened. It's the same thing they actually had in April. There was a fire at a significant power generation plant. And again, the massive loss of electricity for the majority of residents of this island without even having a hurricane. And everyone goes, what the hell is going on here? And still here we are a number of months later. And listen, I mean, you can only do so much to prepare for a hurricane. But the fact that everyone on the island was without power, and it's not just power, too. When you lose electricity, it means you also lose access to clean water because the pumps and the water treatment facilities are also not operable. So you have an overwhelming majority of residents on the island who are also without water to drink. And, this was a problem back after Maria, too, where it took a year before people got all of these services restored. And even then you had vast areas that, were still on boil warnings and all of this. So, I mean, this is part of our country that often gets ignored, and it is abhorrent what is being done to these people.
These are American citizens. And so now here's the question. Let's really dig into it. Like, what's going on here? The American Prospect wrote about this before this grid even failed. Let's put this up there on the screen. In August 19th, 2022, Puerto Rico's electric grid is on again, off again. Essentially what they point to is that despite the nearly $10 billion that FEMA has appropriated specifically for the Puerto Rico electric grid, and as I alluded to, the tens of billions of dollars the U.S. Congress has delivered to Puerto Rico, that basically what has happened is a colossal story of mismanagement, bureaucratic incompetence, and I'm just going to go ahead and allege that there is some corruption going on here. Because, Krystal, what has happened is that FEMA appropriated this $10 billion. The Puerto Rico Power Authority basically lost all credibility after the shutdown in Maria, and so they did what everybody always does in this situation: let's privatize it. And by privatizing it, they hired this firm like Luma Electrical Grid I think it was in 2021 in order to run their power system. Turns out Luma continues to charge them very high market prices and has not been able to deliver power consistently without rolling blackouts for this entire period. There also has been standoffs with local authorities where they refuse to turn over documents. This has turned into a colossal story of incompetence, corruption, lack of oversight. Clearly a hell of a lot of people are making a ton of money off of this. And the people of Puerto Rico, 5 years after Maria, before this hurricane even hit, we're already experiencing massive rolling blackouts, high prices, unreliable power, unreliable grid, unreliable infrastructure.
That's right.
And the crazy thing is that to date, they have only spent about 19% of the $28 billion in funding that FEMA committed to the grid recovery.
Right.
And in fact, they have spent the vast majority of their spending on emergency relief like debris removal. Now, look, obviously debris removal and all that is good.
Gotta have that too.
I would just think that some sort of hardening of the grid, investment and all of that probably would have happened. There's also been a delay here in Washington from the Biden administration, just so everybody knows. Some $10 billion in funding wasn't released until very recently. Biden's been in power for almost 2 years, people. And so clearly there's been massive incompetence on the island. There's been massive incompetence here in Washington. And I think it's a media story too, which is that at the time they're like, oh, Trump, all this. And I'm not gonna deny that Trump probably did hold up funds for Puerto Rico for some like petty, reason. But this clearly just showed the fact that it happened again. I'm like, this is a much bigger systemic story. This has nothing to do with Donald Trump at this point. I'm like, this is years of corruption, mismanagement, neglect, just insanity that millions of people are paying the price for.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I mean, at this point, we only have the broad outlines of what went wrong here. We really need some investigative journalism to like TikTok of where were the fail points and what the hell happened. Where you only are spending $5 billion out of the tens of billions that were appropriated. Why? What happened here? What was the holdup? Where were the failure points? And then to your point about just how unconscionable this whole situation is. So they've never had a grid now since Maria that's reliable. It's been on again, off again, blackouts. This fire that I talked about back in, I think it was April, that caused massive blackouts on the island. Nevertheless, the price of electricity has increased 7 consecutive times this year alone. So in spite of the fact that the service is completely unreliable, you can't depend on it, it's a disaster, still hiking up the rates and putting the screws to the people on the island. I mean, it is a massive failure. It has been overlooked by the media, and we wanted to shine a light on what these people are going through right now with, at the moment, no end in sight. And again, it's not just electricity, which is bad enough, but you're also talking about access to clean water, and then you're talking about all of the spill-on effects of what that means and the type of illnesses that can spread when you don't have access to clean water. So it is a true humanitarian catastrophe going on in Puerto Rico right now.
And what I alluded to earlier is, again, the media, they can't help themselves. They can't just tell you about what's going on here. Let's put this up there on the screen. New York Times, they say the 3 reasons that Puerto Rico, what's the number 1 reason that they say? The Trump administration restricted aid funds. Once again, that may be true, but it's been several years since he was president now. And actually, FEMA's delays and bureaucratic incompetence comes all the way up until 2022, Krystal. I'm just reading, government GAO reports to prepare for this segment from 2021, where they're again talking about the fact that they have this money, some of it hasn't been spent, it's not really being oversight, from FEMA. Puerto Rico's kind of spending it however it wants. Weirdly enough, is privatizing its power. Power rates are going up. Blackouts are continuing. The guy who's in charge of Luma is like being protected somehow in like some weird quasi-legal scheme. This, by the way, does not even to mention their debt obligations, because the debt, the Puerto Rico Authority or whatever is like $9 billion of debt. Puerto Rico has all these issues where they're not allowed to like discharge their debt because it's a territory and not a U.S. state, which is like a whole thing that involves bond traders and some other stuff as well. Anyway, the point I'm making is this is like a colossal disaster that's been slow moving, and they just can't help themselves. Like, they always try to have to make it about Trump instead of telling us, like, no, what's the fail point on Luma? Who is this Luma guy? CEO. What's happening with this dude?
Because we were trying to figure out yesterday, like, what the hell is going on here? And so we're Googling and finding, like, oh, the New York Times has a write-up of 3 things that went wrong. We're like, because they sort of contradict themselves immediately after saying, like, well, it's Trump's fault. And it's like, I don't doubt that, especially immediately after Maria, no doubt that he was a disaster, a jerk, and all of that stuff. But then in the very next section, they're like, well, they actually haven't spent all of the money. So it's not that there isn't enough money, but for some reason, it hasn't been spent. Well, what are those reasons? Are there projects not getting approved by the government so that there's these like holdups and they're trying to go forward, but it's just stuck in a bureaucratic morass? Is that the issue? Is it corruption that's the issue? Is it misspent? Like, they don't tell you any of that. I mean, they do point also to, the fact that the climate crisis means that you have wetter storms, but actually, weirdly, there is a prediction that this would be like one of the worst hurricane seasons in history.
Yeah, people had said that before. I don't know how much to put in these prognostications.
Yeah, and then eerily, it's actually been one of the
so far
mildest so far, which is kind of like, actually makes me a little bit like uneasy, but In any case, there's clearly a lot more going on here, and the best write-up we could find was from The Prospect, who are always doing incredible work. You should really support them regardless of your ideological predisposition, because they actually tried to dig into the details of what happened here, and they were sounding the alarms in August, saying that if there is a hurricane that hits this island, which is almost certainly going to happen during this hurricane season, they're going to be screwed. Lo and behold, it didn't take a rocket scientist to predict that all of this was going to happen. So I would love to see a lot more digging into what exactly the chain of events was here. How did they end up right back in the same situation?
Look, these are American citizens. You know, we shouldn't tolerate it in Jackson, Mississippi. We shouldn't tolerate it in San Juan, Puerto Rico. It's just not acceptable. And everybody was willing to say that, you know, whenever it was Trump. And now, you know, I mean, this really is remember the way that FEMA was scrutinized in Katrina and under Trump? Once again, I actually support that, you know, in terms of looking into all these. But you can't selectively apply the pressure. The president needs to be getting just as much pressure now as Trump did back then. At the time, they're like, oh, this is racism, all of that. It's like, well, you know, the same dynamic is happening here. And these guys are like more focused on the Queen's funeral. I care about the Queen's funeral too.
I don't.
You know, but we got 3 million people without power in San Juan, like, or in Puerto Rico. Like, that's you know, it's a colossal disaster.
It's a disaster.
American citizens.
Absolutely.
Once again.
Human crisis going on right there, and we'll stay on top of it. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.